Well, my journey to the World Bank, I think, is partly because about 5 years ago, the World Bank started to work on what we refer to as forced displacement quite seriously. And it was looking for teams of interdisciplinary practitioners and academics to bring their skills to the topic. I think there was an awareness that it was not enough to have those from the legal fraternity who constitute those mostly in the humanitarian community, and certainly not only economists who tend to dominate institutions like the World Bank. So someone like myself, who's a sociologist / political scientist, as well as others who work on water and sanitation, agriculture, a whole array of other issues, we're really being asked to come and help with this agenda. And there's a sense that there's a need for development actors to be more active in this space. And so I think that's really how I came to this work. So I'm a social development specialist at the World Bank, and I'm usually based in DC, but I'm currently in my hometown, Johannesburg. So I'm going to be speaking about what the World Bank's approach is to forced displacement, what it is we're contributing to this agenda. So first of all, what are we trying to achieve? The World Bank has two goals, what we call twin goals. And our work on forced displacement is very much anchored in these twin goals. The one is poverty reduction, and the other is boosting shared prosperity, or in other words, reducing income inequality. And so all the projects we engage in and research is ultimately driven towards these two goals. The second is that we focus on medium to long-term socioeconomic dimensions of forced displacement. So we see our role as complementary to humanitarian actors or those who respond to emergencies such as the UNHCR. Our knowledge and our engagement with government is already on long-term issues. And so that is where we see our place in this agenda. And in that same light, we don't only, our work doesn't only support refugees or asylum seekers, but very much we look at the impact of refugee asylum seeker presence on local communities and see what can be done in that regard. We are, after all, a bank, and so we have to leverage that comparative advantage. And so I think a few colleagues have mentioned the challenges with financing, and particularly governments in Africa who have long been hosting refugee communities, but have not been getting the financial aid they need. And so one of the important contributions we make is providing financing, and I'll speak more to the new financing modalities that we developed in response for this agenda. The other is data analytical work. We are also a knowledge bank. We develop research, and of course, in this area, there is a dearth of data, empirical work in particular areas, which we try to contribute to. And also we have a convening power to bring together various actors, particularly governments, to engage in continuous policy dialogue. And that's one of our key comparative advantages. And finally, we want to continue to strengthen global partnerships with the likes of UNHCR as we do this work. So I think there are three main ways that the World Bank has contributed to this agenda in the last 7 years or so. The first, like I said, is analytical output. So there's been a lot of funding directed to developing mixed method research, longitudinal research, to try and better understand the impacts of forced displacement in various contexts such as Kenya, Lebanon, Colombia, and on issues that are globally relevant or of interest to various countries and subregions, such as the impact on social cohesion, the impact on jobs. And I'll speak to some research we did in Southern Africa on jobs in particular. Another key area is providing technical advice on policy reform. For us, it's important for governments to recognize refugees, consider them in their long-term plans and their developmental plans. And that involves giving them advice on what it would mean to, for instance, give refugees the right to work if they don't already. And then finally, on financing, and I'll speak to that in the next slide. Excuse me. So we have two financing modalities which we created in response to this agenda. The first is the Global Concessional Financing Facilities, or GCFF. And the rationale in creating this particular financing modality was that traditional financing resources for middle-income countries such as Lebanon, Jordan, and others is insufficient. And so this was created to fill that gap. Then we have IDA, or the International Development Association, which is a financing model that supports the poorest countries, predominantly in the African continent. So the GCFF was a financing facility that was created together with the UN as well as the Islamic Development Bank. And essentially what is done is, what we do is buy down the interest rates for projects that are supported by other MDBs. And then we have IDA, which in its first iteration, we were provided with $2 billion over a 3-year period. And this money was earmarked to poor host countries in particular. So countries such as Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Burundi, Rwanda, and others on the continent who host significant numbers of refugees. And they were given this funding either grant basis or concessional loans. So loans that have very low interest rates or longer terms to pay back the funding. And again, our focus is on medium to long-term investments. So working on issues that we as a development bank already work on. So for instance, mitigating shocks against access to healthcare, access to education, water and sanitation, ensuring that the projects that we invest in are led by government systems so that they're sustainable, particularly local governments. And then also investing in preparedness, making sure that countries invest in warning systems, because we know that displacement is a recurring issue in certain parts of the continent in particular. And then the eligibility criteria to get this funding in terms of population is quite low. If you see those numbers, a country needs to be hosting upwards of 25,000 refugees. We know this is the case for great majority of countries, or 0.1% of the population. They need to be signatories to an adequate protection framework. And this usually is in reference to the 1951 convention, or they need to have the intention or a strategy that looks towards long-term solutions for refugees and hosts. And that last aspect, that eligibility criteria, is often done by the UNHCR. So we work very closely with the UNHCR in doing this eligibility check. So ultimately, in summary, the key elements of our approach as the World Bank is ensuring that our work is evidence-based to the extent possible. We do a lot of analytical work, that we invest in preparedness in terms of warning systems, that we address long-standing development issues such as jobs, infrastructure, that our approach is area-based, and that means it doesn't discriminate between refugees and local communities in its approach. And where possible, we encourage governments towards enabling refugees to have the right to work and freedom of movement. And I've mentioned a few others. I mean, for instance, in Burundi, we have a project that focuses on returnees. So where it is actually happening, where you do have refugees returning, we do also have projects in that regard. I'll just turn briefly here to talk about what our approach has been in the African continent. What we've done is we usually start with engaging with governments and talking to them about the kind of research they would be interested in to better understand their forced displacement or mixed migration context. We've done this in 3 sub-regions, in the Lake Chad region, the Horn of Africa, and if you see there, just a little detail, both of these first reports have led to regional projects. The one in the Horn of Africa has led to a fairly successful project that involved IGAD and those countries you see below. Uganda since received more than that initial 50 million on a purely grant basis. The projects have been focused on addressing water, access to water, health and education, environmental degradation, and as well as access to livelihoods for both locals and refugees. The final report you see there is one that I led with a team I work closely with. And the idea really for this report was to focus on, well, what is the impact that refugees and migrants have on jobs in South Africa? South Africa being the key focus, obviously, because it's the main hosting country in this region. And what we find is that actually immigrant workers generate jobs for South Africans. And we have 3 key reasons why. The first is that most immigrants engage in self-employment more than South Africans do. So in that sense, they create their own jobs. So you have 25% of total jobs for immigrants are entrepreneurial compared to 16% for locals. The high employment rates and higher labor earnings has positive effects for the economy. It helps the economy grow, which obviously has positive impacts on South Africans as well. But also we know that in some instances, migrants hire South African locals. And then finally, we also found, of course, it's not always the case, but in some cases, foreign and local born workers specialize in complementary tasks. They don't necessarily compete directly with one another. And this complementarity also creates positive externalities for the wider economy. Now, I'm happy to discuss this final slide a little more on the challenges we've had in engaging in Southern Africa and why this report has not necessarily led to any regional projects the way it has in the Horn of Africa and in Lake Chad.